Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books from the Ohio County Public Library. This is our live stream edition, of course. Today we're going to go to the Heinz History Center virtually through Melissa Marinaro, who's director of the Italian American program at the Senator John Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. And she has a new book that she's going to tell you about called Highlights from the Italian American Collection. There it is, Western Pennsylvania Stories, a Visual History, presented through their collection of artifacts and archives. So here is Melissa Marinaro.
Hi, well, thank you, Sean, for inviting me to be on the virtual presentation today. And I'm really excited to present to you our new book, Highlights from the Italian American Collection, Western Pennsylvania Stories, which is the latest publication from the Senator John Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So today I'm going to talk to you about the book. And before I do, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Italian American program, because I'm not sure how many people are familiar with us, but we're a program that began at the History Center in 1990. So this is our 30th anniversary in 2020. And our role is to document the history and culture of Italian Americans in Western Pennsylvania. And I will say that culturally, Panhandle of West Virginia, Eastern Ohio, Northern West Virginia, when we're talking about Italian Americans, I know we're talking about a very similar culture. And so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what you can expect from the book. So first I want to tell you a little bit about how the book is formatted, and then I'm going to dig into some of the stories. But what you're looking at in this slide is the cover and our table of contents. So how we approached creating this book, because we have a pretty significant collection. It's one of the largest of its kind in the United States. And we have over 1,000 archives. We have thousands of artifacts let me back up. We have thousands of artifacts, thousands of archives, and we have over 400 oral histories. So we looked at what was in the collection and we condensed it into selections in 4 chapters. So you can see in the table of contents, we have the journey to America, work, food, and community. So within those 4 chapters, we are exploring stories that fit into that theme. So what we're looking at right now is chapter 1. And each chapter begins with a 4-page spread. And in it, you get a little bit of basic information to lead you into the stories that you're going to experience in the book. So of course, in this chapter, all of the objects that are featured are items that were on the journey on the steamship across the Atlantic. And this is great because it allows us to start the story about Italian Americans coming to the United States. One of the things to note about all the chapters is that we try to take a chronologic approach in telling the entries. So you can really see the passage of time in the objects. With the journey to America, we have stories about the Great Immigration period from 1880 to 1924, which really begins the mass migration of Italians to the United States. We have stories from the interwar period after the quotas were passed and people had to go through a different system in order to immigrate to the United States. And then we also have stories from the post-war period. We know that after 1945, we had a generation of Italian migrants that came to the United States. So within this one chapter, you'll see examples of all those different immigration narratives, which brings me to a point that I think you'll see across the entire book, which is that we recognize there's no one singular Italian American experience, but many different experiences that make up being an Italian or an American of Italian heritage. Our second chapter is focused on objects and stories related to work, what those Italian migrants did when they came to America and how they earned a living. So in this chapter, you're going to see examples of the tools that were used by laborers, both skilled laborers and unskilled laborers, things related to specific trades. On this page, you can see we have an image of a cobbler shop and a cobbler tool. But I also have some stories in here related to the work of women, because the recognition that we had both men and women working throughout the period when Italians came to the United States. So you'll see here on this page, we also have the record of a midwife. So showing that even within the gender roles that were set out for the day, we have examples in the collection of men at work and women at work. Now we're looking at a page from our chapter on food. And I mentioned there's 4-page spreads that begin each chapter. So here you're looking at the latter part of that. And in the chapter on food, we have items that are related to Italian foodways and things related to Italian American cuisine. Because as we know, over the generations, as Italians brought their food traditions to the United States, they modified and adapted those traditions. And today we see a hybrid cuisine that is Italian American. So within this chapter, we see that transition of time and of this object showing the story of how Italian immigrants assimilated into American culture. When we talk about the ethnic group, food is often one of those things that not only unites us as an ethnic group, but I think food has been a really important entryway for people who are not Italian American to get to understand some things about our culture and our experiences in America. The final chapter are stories about community. And we interpreted community to mean everything from an actual neighborhood, small town, or ethnic enclave to things like fan groups, mutual beneficial societies, churches, all of these different forms of communities that form within neighborhoods, towns, and cities. And again, this chapter is wonderful at getting at this notion of the diversity within the Italian American experience. In Western Pennsylvania, I'm sure as in the Panhandle of West Virginia, we see that Italian immigrants came from all over the Italian peninsula, not simply the South. And this collection really shows that we had people that came from all different regions of Italy. And so I'm going to point out in the lower corner, we have a picture of the North Italy Beneficial Society, which was a club that was in East Liberty, which was a neighborhood of Pittsburgh that at the time was considered Little Italy. And very interesting about that neighborhood, it was not just Northern Italians, it was people from Abruzzo, people from Calabria, Neapolitans. So it really was a diverse Italian neighborhood in the sense that we had people speaking different dialects and maybe practicing cultural traditions that would have been native to their region. So this wraps up my talking about the form of the book. So this is what you can come to expect from the different chapters and the themes. And what I'd like to do right now is show you some of the entries from the book to talk to you about how we organize those and share some of the really great stories that we have in the collection. So one of the things that I recognize a lot of people are going to be interested in is locating their own heritage within the book. And one of the ways that we try to connect your experience with the experiences that we have documented is through the maps. So you can see on this entry, we have 2 maps. One is a map of Italy and one is a map of Western Pennsylvania. So in the map of Italy, we have the region of Molise highlighted, and that's because the object that you're looking at, which is an aluminum pot and ladle, those came from the town of Rocco Mondolfi in Molise. When the family immigrated to Western Pennsylvania, they came to live in Stowe Township, which is a small town just outside Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. So using these maps became a way for us to try to geographically locate the objects within both Italy and within our region. So that's something to look for with all of the entries, is what information is being told through the map. This is also a really great example of an object that has corresponding archives and oral histories that help to enhance the story of the object. So this pot we collected several years ago from a gentleman named Joseph D'Andrea, and he was the honorary vice consul of Italy in Pittsburgh. And he came to our region in the late 40s after World War II. And because of being in Molise, many of you may know Molise, Campania, and Abruzzo were areas that saw very heavy fighting during World War II. And the civilian experience especially was not great in that part of Italy. And Joseph and his family ended up staying in their town during the war, and his mother took in refugees and Jewish migrants. And so the image that we're looking at, you can see on the right here, we have Joseph as a child with his brother, mother, and a family friend. And in Joseph's oral history, he tells a story about an incident that happened on these steps where a milkmaid and a couple refugee mothers were fighting over milk. That's you can see on the right page, we have a quote that's in a blue color. So that's the quote where Joseph is telling the story, and that's an excerpt we pulled from the oral history. Long story short, the milk was spilled. And so this aluminum pot that Joseph's family brought with them to America, he kept into adulthood because it was a reminder of the consequences of war. And so this is something that has a really unique story. It has a great oral history telling the story, and we have a picture so we can envision that incident taking place. So this is a prime example of how the three types of materials we have in our collection work together. And this was a goal. We try with many of our entries to include, if possible, all three, because they give us a deeper understanding of the object and its story. Here's another great example of a collection and how we're trying to feature it, because this actually has multiple pieces. So previously we saw a story that was told through one object. In this entry, there's actually several objects. Some of you maybe have visited Bloomfield in Pittsburgh, which is our contemporary Little Italy, and a lot of people go there to eat Italian food. This colander came from Dell's restaurant, which started as a grocery store in East Liberty and moved to Bloomfield. And 3 generations of the family ran this restaurant before it closed. So with this entry, we were able to include multiple pieces. And if I were able to turn the page, you would see there's actually 2 more pages filled with objects, because this restaurant was around for 75 years. And so it had quite a long legacy of being a staple in Little Italy. And many people would go there for Sunday dinner classics, which we've come to know as a lot of Italian-American foods, big meatballs, lots of pasta. One of the major differences between Italian-American fare and Italian cuisine is because of prosperity in America, we were able to work with heavier meats, heavier cheeses. We start to see portions become a lot larger. And so this is something that is reflected in restaurants as well. Next, I'm going to share something that also comes from our community chapter. And so this is a wonderful example of an object that has become very recognizable at the museum, as I think it is around our entire region. And this is a statue of San Rocco. And this particular San Rocco was used in a procession in East Liberty. As I mentioned, that was our Little Italy. And he was processed from 1931 to 1961 throughout the streets. And San Rocco is a very interesting saint because he's come to be venerated all throughout our region. We still see celebrations to San Rocco in Western Pennsylvania. And he is associated with sickness and with plagues. So you can see here he's pointing at a wound on his thigh, and that is to signify that he has a disease. And the story of San Rocco is that on his pilgrimage to Rome, he contracted this infectious disease and he went off to die, and a small dog brought him loaves of bread, and an angel appeared to him and healed him. And so this is why we often see San Rocco depicted with a small dog holding a loaf of bread. So we have this currently on display at the museum. We are open to the public, and so if people choose to visit the museum and see the San Rocco in person, he is actually one of the first pieces in our Italian American display when you enter the 4th floor Special Collections Gallery. I always like to joke that as soon as you see San Rocco, you know you're at the Italian American display. But this is a really fantastic piece because he also made the journey across the ocean. When the gentleman who started the procession wanted to do it, he originally appealed to some local churches in town, and then became aware that he was, going to do it himself. And so he actually returns to his hometown in Marinaro in Calabria to get the San Rocco and brings him back. And it's a pretty big piece. It's about 4 feet tall. So it really is a substantial icon, and it's had quite a journey. This is a really fantastic entry because I think this is one of the more unique collections that we have at the museum. And what this is these are pieces from a 33-piece Precipio. And the Precipio is the tradition of doing a Christmas village that typically would surround a nativity scene. And this is popular all throughout Italy. And many people will create their Precipio to mirror their native surroundings. And so even though the tradition is very well known for its Neapolitan varieties, we see it in the north of Italy, we see it in the south of Italy, and while we might see those regional distinctions, it is something that is celebrated by Italians of all different backgrounds. And so this example comes from a small town called New Kensington, which is up along the Allegheny River in Westmoreland County. And it's a mill town that had a fairly significant Italian-American population. And the Albini family Precipio was something that not only the Italians, but many of the Catholics in the neighborhood enjoyed this Precipio because the Albini family would open up their home and let people come and enjoy it. And each year, Albino Albini, the father, would make a new piece of the Precipio with his 3 children. So in this entry, you can see the picture of 2 of the children as adults, Sam and Rose, and they shared fond memories of creating the Precipio with their father. So this is wonderful because it's not just talking about the religious tradition of doing a nativity scene, but also that family tradition of togetherness and spending time together and making together. So I think it's a really wonderful story and something that is truly unlike any other because it really speaks to the Albini family. Here's another really great piece that comes from the chapter of the Journey to America. And some of you may have heard potentially of Crescenti produce if you ever went to the Strip District in Pittsburgh to pick up wine grapes. I know traditionally people would come from all over to go to the Strip to get their produce. And so some of you might recognize this. But this shawl came from a woman named Providenza Crisanti, and her husband Giovanni ran a produce wagon. He came to Pittsburgh with his brother. They were orphaned, and they were sent to Pittsburgh to be raised by an uncle. And while they were here, they started peddling. They were hucksters, and we can see the picture here of Giovanni with his produce cart. But eventually, they grew the business into a wholesale produce business that was working out of the produce terminal in the Strip. And so they were helping to get produce from the wholesaler to different grocery stores, restaurants, and small businesses. And so when it was time for him to marry, he did what many Italian men of that era would do, and he went back to his hometown in Sicily to look for a wife. So Providenza Crisanti, who had recently had a broken engagement, was asked, Giovanni asked her family for her hand, and she's the only person from her family who comes to the United States. And so we have in this entry an oral history quote from Providenza where she talks about when she learns she's coming to Pittsburgh, and what she knows about life in Pittsburgh, and talking about this experience of people coming back from America, and they have more things, they have more money. It sounds like their life is better. So she's talking a little bit about that experience of being a young bride, which we know that many of our Italian grandmothers and great-grandmothers, that was their experience, was getting married in Italy and then shortly after migrating to a new home. So this here is a shawl that Providenza wore on one of the journeys across the ocean, because the family did go back and forth between Pittsburgh and Sicily until the tensions in the 1930s in Europe started to rise, and then it became unsafe, and Americans were not allowed to travel back to Europe. Now, here's another story of migration, but this is very different because Providenza's story is in the late 1920s and 1930s, during that period we associate more with the Great Migration. Angela Pasquale comes after World War II, and so she has a very different migration experience. She comes from a small town in the province of Avellino, and she is engaged to be married through an arrangement between families, and her husband is in Pittsburgh. So being a young woman who is growing up in 1950s Italy, Angela's a lot more aware of the world outside her paese in Italy. She's reading fashion magazines. She's seeing a little bit of television here and there. So she not only knows about other European styles, but she knows a little bit about post-war America. And so this suit that we have in the entry is something that Angela makes because she's getting ready for her trip to come to the United States. And she also has an oral history quote where she's talking about how, because she liked to read French magazines, she designed this suit with that style in mind, not realizing that once she gets to the United States, the style may be different. And she, in her oral history, talks about arriving in Ellis Island, wearing the suit, and having people look at her, and quickly recognizing that maybe this experience isn't what she thought it was going to be. So, you know, again, getting at this idea of through the course of the book, you can see the transition of time in the objects. And we can also see that, again, experiences, and in particular immigration experiences, don't all fit into one nice, neat package. They're different. This is a really interesting piece, and this is something that we actually didn't get a chance, or we didn't get until fairly recently. But one of the things I've worked on a lot at the History Center is working on our mid-20th century collections, and collections around World War II, because World War II is a very very pivotal moment in Italian American history when it comes to assimilating. Prior to World War II, many American-born people of Italian descent didn't feel American. They still felt Italian. And in World War II, that starts to change as we start to see high enrollment in the military because of the draft. We see a lot of both American-born and Italian-born people of Italian descent who are trying to show their allegiance to America and to their homeland. And so we really start to see that identity shift in this period. So this tank came in as a part of trying to document that story. And this is a really unique story because this is talking about the experience of Italian POWs in the United States. We have a wealth of content at the History Center about Italian Americans in the US military, and there's some things related to that in the book. But this is the story of a gentleman who was in the Italian army. He was captured by British forces and then eventually transferred into United States custody. And this happened to thousands of Italian soldiers at the time, and many people didn't realize that we had Italian soldiers in captivity in the United States in camps across America. So this particular gentleman, how he relates to Western Pennsylvania is he had an older brother who came to the US and started a family, and his younger son was in the Air Force. Well, at the same time, this man who's in the Italian army, he is captured and he's at a base very close to where his older brother's son, which would be his nephew, is stationed. So here in this newspaper clipping, you can see the Post-Gazette gets wind that this family is going to reunite. And so this story is touching on the unique experience Italian Americans were in during World War II, as Italy was at one point an enemy of the United States and part of the Axis powers. And so that really complicates not only Italian and American relationship with their homeland, but it splits families because many people had families living on either side of the ocean. So the Roberto family is an example of that. Very unique about this collection is this tank, and that was made by Donato Roberto while he was in captivity from fruit crates that he disassembled. It is a model replica of the Fiat tank that he was in when he was in North Africa, and he makes it as a gift for his nephew being the young man that was born here in Pittsburgh and was serving in the Air Force. Eventually, Donato Roberto is able to immigrate to the United States. But first, he is working in Venezuela. And this is another little interesting sidebar because after World War II, it was not easy to migrate to the United States. The quota system was still restricting how many Italians could come. And because of the state Italy was in the post-war period, we see a lot of Italian migrants going to Canada, going to South America, Australia, other parts of Europe. And oftentimes for those post-war migrants that came to the US, they may have spent time laboring in another country in order to get the ability to migrate. Sponsorships were something that took a long time to happen in that era. So in a sense, this tank, not only talking about the war experience, but talking a little bit about that immigration experience too. So this just gives you a taste. I'm gonna actually exit out of my screen now, but this just gives you a taste of the many different types of stories that we have in the book. We designed this so you can just dive right in at any section and read a singular story, or you can read it from front to back and you'll get the entire narrative. But either way, I designed it with our community in mind because I know that we have so many people out there with rich Italian heritage, And a lot of what we have at the History Center directly relates. And so we wanted to share it in a way that we knew would be user-friendly and also fun, because the collections are gorgeous. The photos are bright and colorful, and we're so proud of what we built, and we're thrilled that we have a way that we can share it with you, especially in this era of COVID. We're glad that we have something that we can send to you, and you can enjoy it from the safety of your own home and still get to learn from the materials we have collected at the museum.
Well, thank you, Melissa. Very well done. I want to see if anyone had any questions. If you do, put them in. This is the time to put them in the comments field. I do have a question.
Yeah.
The book has a part about restaurants and Tambellini's.
Mm-hmm.
So, and everyone knows probably that Bloomfield is Little Italy now. What are some of the other Italian restaurants that historically have been favorites in Pittsburgh? Because I remember Tambellini's as a kid.
Oh, yeah. And there are many Tambellini's. And we actually have several of the Tambellini's documented, because what's interesting is it's not one family unit, it's an extended family. And there's actually two Tambellini families that share the name. They both come from the province of Lucca. And in general, in Pittsburgh, the Lucchese were very active in not just the restaurant business, but the entire foodways business, manufacturing, grocery stores, bakeries, candy shops. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they had a mutual beneficial society, the Lega Toscana. And within that community network, we see a lot of exchange of talent, of, in some cases, actual businesses, supplies. And so Tambellini's, Silvioni's, DeLuca's, Common Plea, which is around now. I'm trying to think of some of our other Lucchese restaurants that are around. I'm blanking, but in general in Pittsburgh, they really have made a mark on our restaurant business. But Dell's, they were from Abruzzo. Minutello's, that was another really big restaurant that we have documented that was in Shady Side. And in particular, they did a lot of banquets for christenings and first communions and other religious rites. So people who grew up in the city, Poli's, that's another classic one. And the espresso machine that is featured in the book comes from Poli's, and that was a big date night spot. So I know a lot of people have memories of both Tambellini's and Poli's. Those were huge date night spots.
I hate to keep asking about food, but what about pizzas?
Oh, yep. And we have we have a Precipio and pan set that is featured in the book, and those come from a shop that's still around today in Ambridge, over on the Ohio River, called Frank's Pizza. And what's kind of neat about that is you'll read the story. Frank tried a couple businesses that didn't work out, and he was reading Il Progresso, which was the Italian language newspaper that was published out of New York. And they had an ad to learn how to be a pizzaiolo and also you would get the equipment. So what we have in the collection is a part of that suite that came after he did his training. And then of course today, Italian wood-fired pizza is having a huge resurgence. So it's kind of neat when you look at that peel, you realize, Italians were doing it long before mainstream America got into it. But it's great to see it come back. And it's also great to see that it's coming with people getting into artisanal cheese making, meat making, wine making, all of those customs that we've been doing for generations. We're starting to see more people get interested in it.
Yeah, this is making me hungry.
Yeah, me too.
I'll also ask about Franco Harris and Franco's Italian Army. I would be remiss if I didn't as a Steeler fan. But you have the actual helmet that the commander of the Army wore. Is that correct?
We do. And actually, you know what I can do, because this will probably read well from here, but I can open it up to the page where you can see some of, and so there's the helmet, but then we also have just, and this isn't even everything, this is just a sampling, but you know, we have all kinds of things, t-shirts, scarves, knit hats, handmade things like that needlepoint pillow that came out of the fandom. And what's really neat about the story of Franco's Italian army is in the late 60s and 70s, we start to see Americans of ethnic origin start to reclaim their heritage and outwardly celebrate their pride, because in those early years, there was a lot of discrimination, and it wasn't always something that people wanted to be so outward with for fear of it preventing them from getting certain jobs or whatnot. And so with Franco's Italian army, it comes in this era where we aren't ashamed, we aren't embarrassed, and if anything, we're trying to show through the flag that we are Italian. And I just think that's a really great example of how all across the country we see that moment, but for it to come out of a fan group is just really phenomenal. And that use of the evil eye, you know, there's an oral history quote where they talk about putting the Maluk on the other team, and, you know, bringing their cornos with them. It's great. It's taking that superstition that, you know, we had from Italy and applying it to, you know, a football game.
Yeah. And the fact that Franco was half African American and Italian, and that there's that great picture of the committee or whatever, with Franco at the field. And I think even Sinatra visited him. Is that right? Yeah.
That's not in the book, but we do have that image where Sinatra meets him. And yeah, it's really great because it's, one of the things in the book is you get to the entries that are more modern from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. You see not only the assimilation of the group as being fully American, but you see the exchange that occurs between Italian Americans and non-Italian Americans. You know, not everybody lived in an ethnic enclave where they only interacted with Italian Americans. They were living with African Americans. They were living with Eastern European migrants. They were living with American Jews. And so there's a lot of that in the book showing that there was collaboration. There was, I think, you know, we're not an entirely segregated town when it comes to how the neighborhoods live together. And, you know, Lower Hill District is a perfect example of what was a very vibrant, multi-ethnic, multiracial neighborhood. And prior to the urban revitalization, that was probably one of the most integrated neighborhoods we had in the city.
Yeah, and you and I talked before the program about the sign that's pictured in the book that had in multiple languages. Yeah, you can hold that up.
Yeah, I'll pull that up because
it's the coolest thing, in my opinion, at the Heinz Center. I love that. There you have it. That really says it all.
Yeah. And Sean and I were talking about how, you know, for me, it was important to show that while we're looking at this through the lens of Italian Americans, this is an immigrant experience. And I think that from all different immigrant backgrounds, we can find these commonalities, and we can find these patterns and cycles, because here we are living in this particular region of the United States. And so that's why I think these regional collections are really important, because they show that, you know, I personally feel, you know, we're not the same kind of Italian American as, say, an East Coast New York Italian American, a New Orleans Italian American, a Northern California Italian American, because we are shaped by this region, this landscape, and this experience that we had with all the different peoples that also inhabit this place.
Yeah, and what's one interesting thing about Wheeling, it's always been like a little Pittsburgh in that West Virginia is not thought of as an immigrant destination, but Wheeling certainly was. And we had a lot of the same groups of people living together in neighborhoods side by side. I'm going to put up a question by someone we both know, Brian Butko, so you can read it.
Yeah, Tilly's. Okay, so he's asking, was this a particular heavy area of Italian settlement, or does a grouping of restaurants say more about what locals like to eat? That's interesting because I think it can be a little bit of both, because I do know that we had Italians in the area that Brian is describing in that part of Western Pennsylvania. We don't have the Lucchese as much as we see in the city of Pittsburgh, so I can't speak to the region that those restaurants are connected to, but I do think that today, especially for the restaurants that are holding strong, it does tell us about what locals like to eat, because the cuisine that has developed, not just in the United States, but even regionally, it's developing because of local tastes. When Frank's Pizzeria started making the pizza, they were giving away free samples to see if people liked it. And then they did. And then they form their customer base. People, I think, get attached to foods and to foods made in a certain way. And so I do think that today, when we see the places that are still serving Italian cuisine, that maybe aren't following the contemporary food trends, because we're certainly in this farm to table movement right now, which has hit the Italian restaurant community hard because of that changing model. But the places that still have the people that are consuming and going, I think that does say a lot about them and says what they like. And I mean, what's there not to like about Italian food? I think everybody likes it, but I think in particular, we're known for it in this region. So tourists are now coming here and expecting that.
Great. Well, I want to see, does anyone else have a question before we sign off and thank Melissa and let her off the hook today? Any more questions? You have 10 seconds.
Well, while you're waiting, I just want to say that the book is available at the History Center through our e-store. And so for those people who want to enjoy it safely from home, we are taking orders. And I also want to just say thank you to all the people from the History Center, Brian, Liz, Anne, and then, of course, Kara Reed, our fabulous designer, Margaret Hewitt, who helped with our editing. They just did an awesome, awesome job. And so I'm very fortunate that I got some great colleagues that helped to put together this beautiful, beautiful publication.
Yeah, I have a copy, and it is indeed quite beautiful. And I recommend that you get one if you're Italian American, or if you're interested at all in immigration history and the Heinz History Center. Oh, here's a question from the library.
Well, it says, what other regional ethnic collections does the History Center have? We have collections representative of nearly every historic group that's come and settled in the United States. So we have collections related to African American, Irish, Jewish, Slovak, Carpatho-Rus, Polish. We're working now to try to build relationships with new immigrant communities, because we also are documenting contemporary migration to our region. So we're working to connect with the South Asian community, with modern Latin and African groups coming. So I'll put that out as my little plug that, we are very interested in continuing this collection on immigration. So that's a big part of what I do, is continue to work with people to make sure that these stories are documented.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really fun.
It was great. And I just want to mention our Thursday night program will stay in Italy with Lou Volpe as we do our literature and language around the world. And we'll be visiting Italy. So join us. That's Thursday evening at 6:30. Thanks again, Melissa. And we're going to sign off now. Have a good day, everyone.
Ciao.